There are many tales about how the Moon Lord came to dominate the universe. Some suggest that he achieved its goals in spite of the celestial pillars and their accompanying races. Others consider that he conquered each race in turn and now wields them as his own personal army. But it could be that the creatures the Moon Lord seems so inextricably tied to, whatever their allegiance, may be linked to the gods themselves, their existence part of the very fabric of the universe. Gods had begun. Humanity had all players deep and challenging, with different is less likely to get me horribly In the great void before the dawn of universal light, 3 deities of construction called forth the Big Bang. Their names were Empty Space, the goddess of space, A Jing, god of time, and Ria Li Xing, god of reality, and they would set the universe in motion and govern its laws. All at once, a host of other major and minor gods sprung forth from the cosmic aether, and as the prime universal concepts began to take hold, they wrestled to balance the universe, ensuring that all these concepts remained equal, for if they did not, then one must surely dominate the rest. Life must not be without death. War should not exist without peace. Creation must mirror destruction, like freedom needs punishment. It was impossible to have balance and equality without all other concepts remaining equal, and it was not possible to have every other concept if balance and equality were solely dominant. Once the universe had been born, the exact source of its origin came to be known as the Creation Point, a place extremely dangerous for mortals to approach, and one that is said to be a direct entrance to the heavens. Split into 2 segments, the upper of these heavens contains the city of the gods, where the major gods live in a palace surrounded by many houses where the minor gods dwell. The city is protected by a wall, which has 3 towers, each one stationed by one of the 3 gods of universal creation. The lower of these heavens is reserved for members of the sacred races, beings formed by the major gods in an effort to maintain their cosmic balance. Below the heavens lay the underworld, not to be confused with the core of most planets, but the true incarnation of Stygian torment. This underworld was split into 3 layers, the first of which being the literal definition of hell, reserved for beings of pure evil, regardless of if they believed in the gods or hailed from a sacred planet. The second layer would be a minor definition of hell, filled with those who simply did not believe in the gods. The topmost layer, however, was a paradise for true believers, mortals who believed in the gods. While the 3 gods of creation busied themselves with the laws of time, space and reality, the major gods struggled to balance the universal concepts so that one would not become too dominant. Minor gods and goddesses bore small degrees of power to assist in the control of the concepts, but most were focused only towards one specific sub-concept, so something else was needed. To this end, each of the major gods created a unique, sacred race to assist them in their endeavors. Solaris, the god of peace and freedom, formed the Solarians. Living close to a star, they adapted to use melee and counterattack as a way to survive, for it was the light of their great sun that guided them. Their fighting style was honourable, resembling the peace and freedom they embodied, using it only to defend their freedom. Vortexius, god of war and punishment, created the Veloxite. Because they lived near a collapsing star, this race did everything in their power to develop a way to prevent it going supernova. When they knew there was no way to stop it, they fled the technology they had so painstakingly researched, instead going on to create weapons and becoming part of a formidable arsenal. As a result of their planet's turmoil, their fighting style resembled the chaos of war and the punishment of sinners by using deadly ranged weapons to wreak havoc on their enemies. Staria, goddess of life and creation, birthed the Sandrian, who resided inside a cloud of stardust, the planet possessing no atmosphere and being deathly cold. Having nowhere else to go, they would adapt by creating artificial creatures to fight for them, so they could focus on perfecting a way to keep their world warm. Their combat style would represent the creation of life, and they would never be afraid of what their creations were capable of, and as such, they were able to create wide and deadly varieties of artificial life. Born of Nebulus, god of death and destruction, the Nebulite lived within a harsh nebula where they were subjected to scorching heat and pelted with acid rain. They adjusted to their environment by creating spells of short-range teleportation, as well as deadly magical weaponry to combat the nightmares of this terrible world. They would fight with true death and destruction in their hearts, whereas they were constantly on the verge of death themselves. They knew all too well how to pass it on to others. Finally, there was Terra, goddess of balance and equality, who gave life to the Terrarians. They would live on a mixed planet containing a wide variety of environments with drastically different climates. They used a combination of fighting styles, even those vastly different to the other sacred races. For their part in the task set by the major gods, this race were the ones who fully embodied a balance and equality in the universe that was so sought after. For the longest of time, the sacred races lived for the most part lives that were peaceful and normal. That was at least until the Moon Lord came. The Sandrian were the first to fall. Having an army of artificial creatures meant nothing when their enemy had the combined strength of a whole planet, and so it was that the Moon Lord made quick work of them. As the Vortexius fled their own burning planet, they would encounter the Moon Lord by complete accident, but as it happened it would be a very unlucky accident. Even though they were probably the most advanced of the races, their army was disorganized from the efforts to escape their world, and they couldn't muster the strength to fight against the army of artificial monsters that had been usurped from the Sandrians. Too quickly they would fall to the might of the Moon Lord. After 2 of the sacred races had fallen, the Nebulite sensed something was coming, and began their preparation for war. Their planet was hostile, even with the hardened creatures who had evolved on it, so they were sure this would be enough to fend off any invaders. Without fatigue from his conquest of the Vortexius and Sandrians, the Moon Lord would descend onto the Nebulite's world, flanked by his captured armies. Even though they were superior in size and technology, the Moon Lord's force couldn't withstand the near constant and disastrous barrages this planet threw at them. Added to this was the fact that the Nebulite excelled at guerrilla warfare. They were masters of ambush, bolstered by powerful magic, and combined with the natural phenomena that ravaged everything in its path, victory seemed all but certain for the Nebulite. One of the few intelligent lifeforms to do so, the Nebulite possessed the ability to extract fragments from their planet, fragments that could be used as a power source. Even so, despite the huge amount of power they extracted from the fragments, the invaders had overlooked it. That was until now. As they retreated from the superior Nebulite force, one Vortexius took note of this source of power, as it was similar to the fragments of their own world when it was still intact. In fact, after they had managed to conduct a series of tests on the fragment, they concluded that it was the same. The Vortexius had exploited their fragments to power their weapons, and so it was only logical to conclude that the Nebulite were doing the very same, giving them the advantage in battle. Using their knowledge of their own fragments, the Vortexius adapted to the Nebulite weaponry and turned the tide of the war. With their secret weapon exposed and the Sandrian's artificial monsters used as surveillance to watch their every move, the Nebulite could no longer risk continuing the fight, and unconditionally surrendered to the Moon Lord. The Terrarians knew that they would be the Moon Lord's final target, and so they devised a contingency plan, lest the worst were to happen. Some of them fled to the nearest planet, Mars, and with some vortex technology stolen by a small number of Vortexius and Sandrian defectors, they built up a last line of defense before the Moon Lord would come for their world. But what they did not know was that there was already another species hidden on this seemingly lifeless planet. On the other side of the universe, the Moon Lord's armies planned for their next attack. With their newfound knowledge of the fragments, they experimented with how to utilize them to their fullest potential. The final product of their research were the Celestial Pillars, a living, mobile portal utilizing fragments as a catalyst to reach faraway places in the blink of an eye. These would open up a new logistical route to the conquered planets, as the Pillars were capable of opening gateways to the planets their fragments had been derived from. This allowed the Sandrian and Nebulite to gather materials to create new weapons, magical artifacts, and even creatures bred for war. The Solaris, last of the 4 sacred races, knew that the Moon Lord would come for them sooner or later, and as such they prepared extensively for his onslaught, almost like they would be fighting to avenge those who had already fallen. They believed they were the last bastion against this great threat, and as such, each one of them was willing to fight to the last moments of their lives, willing to sacrifice their entire people to end the madness brought about by the Moon Lord. Ultimately, they always had, and always would be, the beings of peace and freedom though, unable to fight with the ferocity of their counterparts. And it was this, and this alone, that had already sealed their fate. Besides, how could anything stand against 3 other races who at this point had more combat capability than any other force in the universe? The war they fought would seem unending, with 2 more enemies emerging for every one they managed to kill. At last they were overwhelmed, and those who survived were forced to surrender and joined the very force who had defeated them. With this accomplishment, researchers of the 4 races, one of whom betrayed their own kind in an effort to save them, gathered fragments of the worlds. They created a machine, a manipulator of sorts, to control the fragments, only finding later that the fragments were far too unstable to be used in tandem. They abandoned the idea and stored the manipulator away within their ship, sending it out into the universe, where it lurks still, a force of unimaginable power. The 4 great and sacred races, heralding from their own troubled planets, fought gallantly against the Moon Lord, but ultimately, like all else, they had fallen to his might. This conquest, though, wasn't enough for the Moon Lord, for what would come next had been his plan all along, his domination of the celestial races, being nothing more than a means to amass an army. His sights had always been on the world situated closest to the creation point, a planet that, at the time, was still called Earth by its residents. Despite their efforts to seed the fences against the Moonlord and his army, nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare that awaited just behind the horizon. Thank you for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. This episode was originally written by Ethacon and submitted as part of Rational Gamers' Your Lore initiative. Because of the quality of the submissions, I would love to see more of what you have, so if you've written some of your own Terraria lore and want to see it on the channel, then send it through to contactrationalgamers@gmail.com. Remember to subscribe for more Your Lore, support the channel by becoming a patron or channel member, and have a great day.